This happened back when I'd been out of the dating game for about a year or so, and being a painfully awkward person who doesn't really get out much, my best friend had convinced me to try online dating. I thought it was a good idea at the time, so I ended up signing up to that OkCupid website. I could just chat with people for a while, get to know them, then I could work out who was creepy and who was not, then just hit up whoever was the best match. So I meet this guy on the site, and we spend a few weeks chatting and getting to know each other. He actually seemed really cool and chill, kinda quirky, but not nearly as red flag waving weird as some of the other guys I talked to. When the time was just right, he asked me on a date, and by that point, I was quite excited about meeting him, so I said, sure, why not? I told the guy that I preferred simple, low-profile dates, so he suggested that I go over to this place till he could make us some dinner, and after that we could watch some indie horror films, which was something we were both into. I told my friend about this, the same one who suggested online dating, and we discussed some of the risks of just going over to his place instead of meeting in a public place first. I get that it's a real roll of the dice doing that kind of thing, but that was the minor detail of me being 6'2" and him being 5'7". I know that's hardly a major height difference, and it didn't bother me that he was shorter, especially when it meant that he probably wouldn't be able to straight up overpower me if anything went wrong with the date. Plus, I got to admit to being a real sucker for a guy that can cook, so that definitely clouded my judgment in many respects. That being said, when I showed up to his place, me and my friend had developed a code word system that we could use through text or calls, and she had all the details of where I was. So if I got there and things just didn't feel right, I could call her or text her, drop the emergency code word, and she'd think of a reason for me to leave and then come pick me up. Anyway, as I said, I arrived and we got up to his apartment so he could show me around. He started emphasizing his bedroom a little too much, commented on how his big bed would fit me, but I just put that down to some awkward bad taste jokes and got him to move on. After that, he then takes me to the kitchen, where I assumed that he was about to try and claw some points back by actually cooking me dinner. He talked about what a good cook he was and how he was going to wow me with his cooking skills. But when it came to it, he hadn't actually bought anything to cook at all. All he bought for our date was this bottle of red wine that he claimed that it was super expensive, I guess. I made the mistake of showing up on an empty stomach, thinking that he was actually going to cook for me. So when I found out that I wasn't allowed to be fed, I was very disappointed and actually kind of angry too. But then, instead of understanding why I'd been so annoyed, the guy kept emphasizing the bottle, telling me how he'd spent like $100-something on it, and that I should be more grateful that I actually dug deep into his pockets to buy something like that. Don't get me wrong, I like wine, but I don't know wine, so to me that thing could have been the rarest bottle in existence, or the cheapest crap from the crummiest liquor store, and I'd never have known it. So instead of having dinner, we ended up talking over this bottle of wine, which I'll admit was pretty good, but not something I'd ever pay hundreds for. The first actual red flag I noticed was when it became blatantly obvious that he was trying to get me wasted. There came a point where if I took so much as a sip from my drink, he'd be all like, "Want to top off?" and pour even more wine into my glass. That combined with the not making any kind of dinner at all, and I started to get very uncomfortable. I still figured that he was just trying to be romantic or whatever, and that he was just dumb as opposed to malicious or predatory. So after pretty much forcing him to let me eat the remains of a bag of chips and some toast, I felt together enough to just carry on with the date and see where things went. I mean, he was also drinking pretty heavily, and I'd always figured those kind of guys would like pretend to drink or something just to make their date drink more. But he was chugging that wine down like a trooper, so I just slowed my sips until all the wine was gone. Then we headed to the couch for some movies. Anyway, we sit on the couch and I asked what movie he picked for us to watch. He'd already picked something out and was keeping it a surprise until I got there and had to tease me with a selection all day like, "You're gonna love this movie. It's so hardcore, so underrated," stuff like that. Gotta admit too, I was actually pretty stoked to find out what he picked, as I knew that he had good taste and we shared a lot of favorite indie horror movies. But then instead of some hidden gem I'd never heard of, something I could actually take an interest in, something that might salvage what had been a pretty crappy date so far, he pulls out a Serbian film. Now for those that don't know, a Serbian film basically bills itself as the most graphically gruesome and disturbing movie of all time. I know some people are really into it and can talk for days about all the metaphors, hidden meanings, and theories surrounding it, but me personally, I hate it. It's just an increasingly violent but meaningless mix of gore and adult movies that has zero value past shock. So when he suggested we put it on, I very politely asked if he had anything else in mind because I'd already seen a Serbian film, and I wasn't all that excited about watching it again, obviously. But nope, he insists we watch it, picking up on the fact that I wasn't into it and then trying to tell me that the only reason I didn't like it was because I didn't understand it. I pretty much decided there and then that this guy wasn't getting a second date, and as much as I was mad at how patronizing he was, I just kept my cool and got my phone out to text my friend our emergency code word so she could end the date. As soon as I got my phone out and started typing, the guy is like vocally irritated when he says, "Who you texting?" His tone and attitude once again affirmed why he wouldn't be getting a second shot at this, but again I just kept my cool and replied, "Just letting a friend know I'll be home late tonight." This is something me and my friend had already planned out, and it worked like a charm. The guy totally thought that he was in the clear and calmed back down again on the assumption that I was going to give him some or whatever. Then a few minutes later, my girl comes through with a call and puts on an Oscar-winning performance that there had been a break-in at our apartment. We live separately. The call volume was loud enough that the guy could hear, and all I had to do was act naturally and sell a bit. My friend then asked if I need a ride from somewhere, and I tell her this guy's whole address down to the zip code just to suddenly let him know that someone knew where I was. I thought I was going to be out of there in maybe 10 to 15 minutes, but then my friend tells me how she had to drive her little sister somewhere and that she was 40-something minutes away. I was livid. It turned out that she had to run an errand for her mom whose car was in the shop, so I guess it was just bad luck more than her not sticking to the plan. But still, I was pretty horrified to think that I'd have to sit through 40 more minutes of such a gross film with a guy that had gotten way weirder and creepier as he'd gotten drunker. For the next 30 minutes, I had to sit through the guy giving me this whole thesis on why a Serbian film is the best indie horror movie since the Blair Witch Project, and that the reason it's so horrible is because it's a mirror which reflects a decaying society or some nonsense. As the minutes tick by, increasingly weird and gruesome things are happening. But basically, there comes a point when something super gross is happening and the kid is involved. I'll just say that. I don't want to tell you exactly what happens in the movie. Less because of spoilers and more because it's so disgusting that I don't want to type it out. But it gets to this really bad part of the movie and the guy next to me starts breathing super heavy and loud through his nostrils. He'd also insisted on turning the lights off, by the way, which admittedly I did agree to. But then picture the sound of heavy breathing right next to you in a dark room and you understand how creeped out I was. I gave my head the tiniest little turn, straining my eyes to see what he was doing, and saw him just staring at the screen. First time he'd been quiet for pretty much the whole movie. I then actually turned to face him to say, "You good dude?" And after giving me this weird little groan of "huh," actually scoops up the couch a little to be closer to me, like so close our hips are touching. I tell him, "Whoa there, buddy. Way too early for that move." But he just sort of whines again and replies, "Why not?" Thankfully, it really was coming close to pickup time, so I could use that as an excuse as to why we couldn't start doing anything. But then he saw it the exact opposite way. Because I was leaving soon, he felt all entitled to getting a little something. Two waves of grossness hit me, one after the other. The first was how poorly he timed his little move on me, coupled with the actual physical contact. Both made my skin crawl, but the second wave of grossness hit me way harder because that's when I considered what actually prompted this little finesse attempt. He'd been staring super intently into some of the grossest, most obscene stuff I'd ever seen on film, and that's what had him wanting to make out. I cannot overstate how completely creeped out I was. I remember recoiling a little, but then he tried to put his hand on my thigh, and then that was it. I was out of there. I didn't care if I had to wait in the street outside. I was not spending another minute in this creepy, handsy guy's dark apartment. I grabbed my purse, stood up and told him I'm sorry, I have to go. After that, I just marched towards the apartment front door and hoped that he wouldn't try and make a scene in the hallway. He didn't actually follow me outside, which I'm grateful for, honestly. But somehow what he did was way worse in terms of how terrifying it was. Picture me walking down the apartment's hallway, almost total darkness, praying that he wasn't about to run up behind me to kill me. And then all I hear in the dark is the screech, and I mean screech, of Lil Luar not leaving. I just zoomed for the door, somehow got it open after panicking that the guy had locked it somehow, then bolted downstairs and out of the apartment building. I kept thinking that he followed me with a freaking knife or a baseball bat or something, and although he didn't, that fear was constantly with me as I power walked up the street, looking over my shoulder every few seconds to make sure that I was still alone. I then gave my friend a call and told her to hurry up, and thankfully she was only a minute or two away, so I was out of the neighborhood and finally safe from the guy, or at least in my mind I was safe from him since I didn't know his neighborhood very well. The whole car ride back, I was telling my friend how a weak start to the date had just descended into this total nightmare, and the whole time she was cringing so hard, until I got to the part about that scene of the movie and how he'd reacted to it. And that's when she started getting scared for me, laying on apologies about taking so long to get to me. Obviously, I forgave her. It wasn't her fault that her mom had a car emergency, but I was still pretty shaken up after having to wait there for so long. I ended up blocking the guy's number before he could try to get in touch with me again, but after a few days of the incident being on my mind, I decided it wasn't enough to just cut him out of my life. He might not have hurt me that night, he might not even try to, but something told me that it was just a matter of time before that guy did something that couldn't be fixed by a pint of gelato and some girl talk. I know it's not illegal to go on a bad date with anyone, and I know this might make me sound like a total Karen in many ways, but I ended up calling the cops just to tell them what had happened. They agreed that it wasn't illegal to be bad at dating, and I knew trying to pursue assault over his touch thing would just be pointless, but the cops were cool in that they said that they keep his name on file just in anything came up in the future, and they actually thanked me for letting them know too. That made me feel like I might have actually done something to prevent anything really bad from happening in the future, and part of me hopes the cops went over to warn him, but maybe that's just wishful thinking on my part. What I do know is how that experience totally warned me off of online dating for a few years, and it wasn't until Bumble came out that I actually started dipping my toes back into the water. I know I wasn't hurt, and I can say that in a world where so many young women's lives are snatched away by violent men, what happened that night still terrified me, and I'd never have guessed that the guy was like that from our few weeks of talking online. But the number one thing I learned from it always lead in a public place that you know well for a first date, and always have an escape plan. This happened back when I used to get on Grindr, but it always reminds me of how glad I am that I'm no longer doing the online dating thing. For those unfamiliar with Grindr, it's a gay dating app that shows guys nearby. It makes you use your location while using the app, but it doesn't give your exact location unless you send it to the person directly. I got a message from a blank profile. No name, no pic, and no bio. The only thing that popped up was how close he was, less than a mile away. This happens a lot because there are a lot of closeted guys out there, especially back then. Being an overweight guy in the gay community, I had to take anything I could, because most gay guys in my community wouldn't even give me the time of day. He started off nice enough, introduced himself as Jesus, and asked how I was doing and all of that sort of small talk. He told me he was into chubbier guys, and after exchanging pics, we both agreed that we found the other one attractive. He asked me if I'd like to come over to play video games and maybe have some fun. I've only met a couple of guys off of Grindr, and although we had some good times, it ultimately didn't pan out. However, I had met them somewhere public first, so I'd never met anyone at their place or had anyone come over to mine. I figured it had been long enough and some casual fun might be nice. Plus, he was really cute, actually my type. He agrees to come pick me up since I'm only a few blocks away. Apparently, he lived in the nearby trailer park. I decide I'd like to shower first, and he says he'll head over. Then he says he's really embarrassed to ask, but wonders if I'd be willing to lend him $20. Supposedly he lived with his mom, and she had left for the weekend without any food money for him. I know it was really stupid in hindsight, but I felt kind of bad for him. I tell him I don't have any cash, but he says that's okay, I could just send him some money through an app. I don't remember what it's called, but it was something like Venmo. I go ahead and send it, take my shower, and then let him know I'm ready. He says he's heading out, but can't find his keys. I say it's okay, I'll just wait outside for him. I hadn't given him my address yet, but I was almost ready to. However, when I asked if he had found them, he had never responded. Minutes went by, then an hour. I messaged him again to ask if he was still coming, and I could see him going on and offline, so I know he read my messages. I finally just accept that he was ghosting me and probably just wanted money. I messaged him one last time and told him that it was pretty messed up, as well as explained that had he just asked, I would have given him the money without having to go through all of that. What can I say? I can be a softie sometimes. Fast forward a couple of weeks. I never heard back from him, so I just blocked him. I get another message from someone on Grindr relatively close to me. His profile is also blank, which raises my suspicions. He tells me he's also into chubby guys, which really makes me suspicious because it's highly unlikely two chubby chasers live so close to me. We trade pics again, and it's a different guy. However, he suddenly asks for money again. In Grindr, you can create as many accounts as you'd like. All you need is an email address. There were tons of spam accounts on there that were automated. It was a real pain. Anyways, I call him out because I was like 95% sure it was Jesus. At first, he acts like he doesn't know what I'm talking about, calls me crazy, and then blocks me. I felt a little bad because I thought maybe I had made a mistake and just chased off a guy for nothing. Then again, his sudden offensive reaction made me have doubts. Weeks go by, and every so often, this same guy tries to fool me even though I don't fall for it. Eventually, I blow up on him and ask him what his problem is. We start going at it, and eventually he says, "You won't say that to my face." I tell him that I would gladly tell him this in person, not that I expected him to actually show up this time. He responded with, "Now, I was a little worried at this point because it crossed my mind that he may not actually be gay. It might be some homophobe looking to bash some gay guys. My mind always goes back to those men who have lost their lives after meeting up with someone on Grindr." However, I realize I never gave him my address. Now this is the conversation we had. I say, at this point my anxiety starts setting off because I did give my address to a guy who had to cancel last minute. But I didn't think anything of it because it was before Jesus had messaged me a second time. I tried to think about what to do, so I decide to try and document his threats. I respond. Now the trailer park is always having police go by there, and my neighborhood is separated from theirs by a bayou. At night, I always heard gunshots out there, so I began to panic. What if he had a gun? What if he brought friends with him? I started freaking out because I couldn't tell if he was just trying to mess with me, or if he really was outside. I had been screenshotting everything and sent it to the Grindr admins to report him for credible threats of violence. I wasn't sure if I should call the cops or not because if he was lying, I didn't want to look stupid. Plus, I wasn't sure if it was even enough for them to do anything. I decided to peek outside from the upstairs window and see if I could spot him. If I could get the make and model of his car, maybe I could at least have something to give the police. I live in the middle of the cul-de-sac, so when I look out the window, I can see all the way to the end of the street. When I looked out, I saw a car I'd never seen before parked on the side of the road at the end. My heart was pounding because I just knew it was him, but a part of me was hoping it wasn't. I decided I'd test him and see if he really was out there. He says, "I'm waiting." "I'm outside already, where are you?" Of course I wasn't, but if that was him and he did know my address, then why wouldn't he just park outside my house? Sure enough, I was right. "Yeah, I see you. You're gonna get it now. Then give it to me, I'm right here. Just you wait." I knew he couldn't see me from his car because I was peeking out discreetly, and our windows have a privacy shade on them where people only see a black screen from the outside. A few more minutes go by and the car takes off. I have a feeling that he used Grindr to triangulate the area of where my neighborhood was, but of course he couldn't find my exact house because it hadn't been him who I'd given my address to. Grindr later sent me a message saying that he'd been banned from the app, and they contacted the local authorities. I never heard anything else after that, so I don't know what became of it. The cops never contacted me if they did pay him a visit, and I never heard from him again. Now I'm married, so I don't use Grindr anymore, thankfully. Still, it took a while before I was able to sleep soundly after that. I rarely left the house, and when I did, I always made sure his car wasn't around anywhere. Okay, so I have something of a confession. I get totally out of control when I have a crush, and I suppose if you were to phrase it so insensitively, then I guess you could call me a stalker. It probably took way longer than it should for me to realize it too. Like, I just figured I was, I don't know, intense, passionate, whatever you want to call it. When actually what I feel for guys is, well, as my psychiatrist put it, it's unhealthy. Whenever I have a crush on a guy, it builds and builds until it's almost completely out of control. Sure, I get the usual stuff at first. Butterflies in my tummy, that giddy euphoria people feel when their crush is around. But I get other things too. Like, there's a lot more, and some things that people might consider kind of scary too. When I like a guy, they're constantly on my mind. They're usually the first thing I think about when I wake up in the morning, and usually the last thing I think about before I sleep too. I look up every social media account they have, and guys tend to be much less careful about their privacy settings, which makes that whole thing super easy. I make sure to see every single post, every comment, every friend, every photo they're in. I check their social media accounts usually more than 4 or 5 times a day. I also Google them online, hoping to stumble across anything new. For years, I told myself that I just like knowing things about my precious. Like, isn't that the point of loving someone? To know them as well as you know yourself? Well, again, according to my psychiatrist, not in quite the same way as I imagined. I tracked down where they live and spend way too long on Google Street View, just admiring the place. I never go by or do anything though. I never want the crush to know how obsessed I really am. That would be absolutely mortifying. My psychiatrist says this is how I know what I'm doing is wrong, and why he knew we could make progress if I put my mind to it. I also tend to get real jealous. I try not to show it, but I have to admit that seeing them having fun with anyone that isn't me, it really tears me up inside. I grow to hate their friends and family immensely, self-inserting myself into every little moment of their lives and telling myself, it better be with me. More fun, more special, more magical, and memorable. How intensely I like someone tends to be based on how long I spend around them and in what context. Like, the less I see them, the less I like them. The more I see them, it's like I'm exposed to something they're pumping out. Like seeds taking root in my brain almost. A good example would be this. In 5th grade, I liked this guy. In 6th grade, the same guy. I became obsessed with him. Summer rolled around and I stopped. School started, I started liking him again. Repeat for 8th grade. Then he moved away for good, and I stopped liking him for good. It was like I couldn't live without him for the longest time. But then out of sight, out of mind too. I know that's not how other people function. Normal people miss someone no matter how far away they are, and no matter how long it's been since they saw them. Not me though, and I think that might be the only saving grace for some of these guys. I can't control my emotions even with the medication I'm given. It's one of the biggest challenges I face with my condition. If I didn't care so much about what I thought my crush thought of me, I would show up to his house and look in through the window, hoping to see him. I would pester all his friends to get every bit of info about him. I thank God sometimes that I've not gone too far, that I still have one foot grounded in reality, even if the other is hovering over the abyss. Judging from what I've said so far, I'm guessing that most of you would assume me to be a violent person, like how a lot of those psychopaths and let's not leave stories end up being. But in fact, I'm the opposite of that. No one I know would ever think of me with such thoughts. I'm bubbly and kind towards those who are kind towards me. I never resort to physical confrontation. It's just not my personality. No one even has a clue how obsessed my thoughts get. And aside from this little confession, I tend to keep things that way. I hate how I get so attached to people, but as my psychiatrist says, at least you're self-aware. I've liked someone for 6 months currently, and I despise myself for it. I pretend not to be obsessed all the time and refrain from speaking about the person 24/7, even though I want to, because I don't want friends and most importantly, my crush knowing about my condition. Like, I'm terrified I will ruin my life because people would judge me for it without getting to know me. I guess that's part of why I'm writing this too. Bottom line is, I need help on how to cope with these feelings if I can. I surprisingly let go very easily. You know that kid who moved in 8th grade that I was obsessed with for like 3 years? When I found out he was moving, I was shocked and sad for about 15 minutes and then didn't really care. It was like whatever button inside my brain just said, oh well, on to the next one I guess. So my issue is just how to handle my feelings when I like someone. Keep in mind this is just a light description of my issue. I felt a lot more than what I described here so far. I hope I get over my current crush over the summer and don't have any classes with him next year, since I would probably fall for him again. I rarely get crushes, but when I do, they better watch out. I've only had 4 crushes in total in my life so far and 3 were part of my obsessions. Anyway, that's about it. I hope I could provide some insight into how female stalker types work, because all that Andrew stuff is just a bunch of bull. That's like a guy's projection, the ignorance of thinking that guys and girls think or act similar, when honestly the reality is much more insidious and arguably much more terrifying.